Welcome to Chapter 13, Expansion, War, and Sectional Crisis from 1844 to 1860. Let's get started. Manifest Destiny, South and North. In 1845, John L. O'Sullivan coined the phrase Manifest Destiny. He believed that Americans had a right to develop the entire continent as they saw fit, which implied a sense of cultural and racial superiority. The Oregon country stretched along the Pacific coast from the border with Mexican California to the border with Russian Alaska. Both Great Britain and the United States claimed it. Oregon fever raged in 1843 as thousands, lured by reports of fine harbors, mild climate, and fertile soil, journeyed for months across the continent to the Willamette Valley. By 1860, about 250,000 Americans had braved the Oregon Trail. Many died en route from disease and exposure, although relatively few died from Indian attacks. Some pioneers left the Oregon Trail and traveled south along the California Trail, settling along the Sacramento River in the Mexican province of California. To promote California's development, the Mexican government took over the California missions and liberated the 20,000 Indians who worked on them, many of whom intermarried with mestizos and worked as laborers and cowboys on large cattle ranches. The rise of cattle ranching created a new society and economy, as agents from New England firms assimilated to Mexican life and married into the families of Californios. Many American migrants in California had no desire to assimilate into Mexican society and hoped for eventual annexation to the United States. However, at that time, American settlers in California were too few. The Plains Indians. As the Pacific-bound wagon trains rumbled across Nebraska, the migrants encountered the Great Plains, a vast sea of grass stretching north from Texas to Saskatchewan in Canada, and west from the Missouri River to the Rocky Mountains. Nomadic buffalo hunting Indian peoples roamed the western plains, while the tall grass lands and river valleys to the east were home to semi-sedentary tribes. A line of military forts, stretching from Fort Jessup in Louisiana to Fort Snelling, then in the Wisconsin Territory, policed the boundary between white America and what Congress in 1834 designated as permanent Indian territory. For centuries, the Indians who lived on the eastern edge of the plains, such as the Pawnees and the Mandans on the upper Missouri River, subsisted primarily on food crops, corn and beans, supplemented by buffalo meat. They also exchanged goods with traders and travelers along the Santa Fe Trail, which cut through Comanche and Kiowa territory, and it connected Missouri and New Mexico. By the early 1840s, goods worth nearly $1 million moved along the trail each year. By the 1830s, the Kiowas, Cheyennes, Arapahoes, and also adopted the horse culture and allied with the Comanches dominated the plains between Arkansas and the Red Rivers. As European horses enhanced the mobility and wealth of the Plains Indians, European diseases and guns thinned their ranks. A devastating smallpox epidemic spread northward from New Spain in 1779 to 1781, killing half of the Plains people. European weapons also altered power relationships between Native American peoples, allowing the Blackfeet, for example, to drive the Shoshones and Crows southward. The powerful Sioux, who acquired guns, ammunition from French, Spanish, and American traders along the Missouri River, also remained buffalo hunters. As nomadic people who lived in small groups, the Sioux largely avoided major epidemics and increased their numbers. Buffalo hunting evolved into a business for many Indians as they traded surplus hides and dried meat for pots, knives, guns, and other Euro-American manufactured goods. Few Native American peoples began to realize that increasing the size of the kill diminished the buffalo herds and consequently would bring an end to the Plains Indians. The election of 1844 influenced the American government's Western policy. To thwart rumored British schemes of North American expansion, Southern expansionists demanded the immediate annexation of Texas. Oregon fever and Manifest Destiny were also altering the political and diplomatic landscape in the North. Responding to Oregon conventions that called for an end to joint occupation of the region, a bipartisan national convention in 1843 demanded that the United States seize Oregon all the way to the 5440 north latitude line. Texas and Oregon became the central issues in the election of 1844. Democrats selected Governor James K. Polk of Tennessee, a slave owner and expansionist who favored annexation of both Texas and Oregon. The Whigs nominated Henry Clay, who again championed his American system of eternal improvements, high tariffs, and national banking, and begrudgingly supported the annexation of Texas. Polk's strategy of linking the issues of Texas and Oregon was successful. Immediately after Polk's victory, Democrats in Congress approved annexation of Texas by a joint resolution to bring it into the Union. War, Expansion, and Slavery from 1846 to 1850. The Mexican-American War. President Polk saw Texas as just the beginning. He wanted American control over all Mexican territory between Texas and the Pacific Ocean, and he was prepared to go to war to get it. Mexico was determined to retain its territories, and when the Texas Republic accepted American statehood in 1845, Mexico broke off diplomatic relations with the United States. Polk, hoping to inspire a revolution in California that would lead to an independent republic and request for annexation, asked Thomas O. Larkin to encourage influential Californios to seek independence, ordered naval commanders to seize coastal towns in case of war, and dispatched Captain John C. Fremont, his heavily armed troops deep into Mexican territory. Polk also sent John Slidell to Mexico on a secret diplomatic initiative to secure Mexican acceptance of the Rio Grande boundary and buy New Mexico and California. Polk also sent John Slidell to Mexico on a secret diplomatic initiative to secure Mexican acceptance of the Rio Grande boundary and to buy New Mexico and California. However, Mexican officials refused to see him. To intimidate the Mexican government, Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor to occupy the disputed lands between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. When a clash occurred, Polk blamed the Mexicans for the bloodshed and called for war. Ignoring Whig pleas for a negotiated settlement, the Democratic majority in Congress voted for war with Mexico. To avoid simultaneous war with Britain, the president accepted a British proposal to divide the Oregon country at the 49th parallel. American military successes. By the end of 1846, the United States controlled much of northeastern Mexico. Naval attacks, a staged revolt supported by Fremont's unit, and army reinforcements allowed American forces to secure control of California in 1847. Santa Anna went on to the offensive, attacking Zachary Taylor's units at Buena Vista in 1847, and only superior artillery enabled a narrow American victory. General Winfield Scott's troops seized Mexico City in September of 1847. Santa Anna was overthrown and the new Mexican government agreed to make peace. The Wilmot Proviso. Conscious Whigs viewed the Mexican War as a conspiracy to add new slave states in the West. Voters seemed to agree, giving Whigs control of Congress through the 1846 election. Polk's expansionist policy also split the Democrats into sectional factions. Anti-slavery Democrats supported the Wilmot Proviso in 1846. a plan intended to prohibit slavery in any new territories acquired from Mexico. The Senate killed it. To reunite Democrats before the election, Polk and Buchanan abandoned their expansionist hopes for Mexico and agreed to take only California and New Mexico. In the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848, the United States agreed to pay Mexico $15 million for Texas north of the Rio Grande, New Mexico, and California. The establishment of the Oregon Territory and the acquisition of New Mexico and California in 1848 seemed to have fulfilled manifest destiny. The Free Soil Party. The political debate over expansion and the desire to limit the power of Southern slave owners encouraged many Northerners to join a new free soil movement. The Free Soil Party, organized in 1848, viewed slavery as a threat to republicanism and to the Jeffersonian ideal of a freeholder society, and not, as the Liberty Party believed, a sin against the natural rights of African Americans. The Free Soil movement attracted much popular support, including Frederick Douglass, the foremost black abolitionists. However, radical abolitionists such as William Lloyd Garrison opposed the Free Soilers' emphasis on whiteness. The election of 1848. Democrats nominated Senator Lewis Cass of Michigan as their presidential candidate for the election of 1848. Cass was an avid expansionist who proposed squatter sovereignty, which allowed settlers in each territory to determine whether its status should be free or slave. The Free Soilers, including Northern Democrats, nominated Martin Van Buren for president. The Whigs nominated General Zachary Taylor, a war hero and slave owner who was firmly committed to the defense of slavery in the South, but not in the territories, a position that won him support in the North. Taylor and his running mate, Millard Fillmore, won the election, but the electoral margin was thin because the Free Soil ticket took New York's vote. The California Gold and racial warfare. Even before Taylor took office, workers for John A. Sutter and the Sierra Nevada foothills of California discovered flakes of gold in January of 1848. By January of 1849, 61 crowded ships had left northeastern ports to sail around Cape Horn to San Francisco. By May, 12,000 wagons had crossed the Missouri River bound for the gold fields. By the end of 1849, more than 80,000 people, mostly men, the so-called 49ers, had arrived in California. American miners treated alien whites fairly, but limited Indian, Mexican, and Chilean access to gold fields and called for laws to expel Chinese miners from California. Few miners became rich, but instead they faced disease and death, and many returned home penniless. Most miners eventually found themselves working for wages for companies that engaged the hydraulic or underground mining. Many others turned to farming. Farming required arable land which was owned by Mexican grantees or occupied by Indian peoples. The subjugation of the Indians came first. In 1848, there were about 150,000 Indians in California. By 1861, there were only 30,000. European diseases took the lives of thousands of natives, but in California, white settlers also undertook systematic campaigns of extermination, and local political leaders did little to stop them. Congress abetted these assaults by repudiating treaties that federal agents had negotiated with 119 tribes and had provided the Indians with 7 million acres of land. Instead, by 1853, Congress authorized 5 reservations of only 25,000 acres each and refused to provide the Indians with military protection. Some settlers simply murdered Indians to push them off non-reservation lands. Other white Californians turned to slave trading. The Mexicans and Californios who held grants to thousands of acres were harder to dislodge. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo guaranteed Spanish and Mexican land grants would be inviolably respected. Although many of the 1800 grants in California were either fraudulent or questionable, the Land Claims Commission created by Congress upheld the validity of 75% of them. In the meantime, hundreds of American squatters, rejecting the notion that so much unoccupied and unimproved land could be held by a few families, set up farms on these grants. They successfully pressured local land commissioners and judges to void suspect grants and encouraged landowners to sell at bargain prices. In Northern California, farmers found that they could grow most eastern crops. Ranchers gradually replaced Spanish cattle with American breeds, which found a ready market as California's population shot up to 380,000 by 1860 and 560,000 by 1870. Wheat and barley farmers cultivated hundreds of acres using the latest technology and scores of hired workers to produce huge crops, which San Francisco merchants exported to Europe at high prices. The gold rush gradually turned into a wheat boom. 1850, crisis and compromise. The California gold rush and subsequent influx of settlers revived the national debate over free soil. In November 1849, Californians ratified a state constitution that prohibited slavery. John C. Calhoun warned of possible secession by slave states and advanced the doctrine that Congress had no constitutional authority to regulate slavery in the territories. Many Southerners and some Northern Democrats were willing to extend the Missouri Compromise line to the Pacific Ocean, guaranteeing slave owners access to some Western territory. A third choice, squatter or popular sovereignty, placed decisions about slavery in the hands of local settlers and their territorial governments. Anti-slavery advocates were unwilling to accept any plan for California that might involve the expansion of slavery in the territories and urged federal authorities to restrict slavery within the existing boundaries and eventually extinguish it completely. Whigs and Democrats desperately sought a compromise to preserve the Union and organized the Compromise of 1850. The compromise included a new Fugitive Slave Act to mollify the South. It admitted California as a free state and abolished the slave trade, but not slavery, in the District of Columbia, to satisfy the North. And finally, it organized the rest of the lands acquired from Mexico into the territories of New Mexico and Utah on the basis of popular sovereignty. The compromise averted a succession crisis in 1850, but resulted in special conventions in the South. In exchange for support of the compromise, moderate Southern politicians agreed to support secession in the future if Congress abolished slavery anywhere or refused to grant statehood to a territory with a pro-slavery constitution. The end of the second party system, 1850 to 1858. Under the terms of the Fugitive Slave Act, federal magistrates in the northern states determined the status of alleged runaway slaves. The law denied accused blacks a jury trial and even the right to testify, and it allowed the enslavement of about 200 fugitives as well as some free blacks. The plight of runaway slaves and the appearance of slave catchers aroused popular hostilities in the North and Midwest, and free blacks and abolitionists defied the new law. Harry Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which evoked sympathy for slaves and outrage against slavery throughout the North, increased Northern opposition to the Fugitive Slave Act. Northern legislatures enacted personal liberty laws, and in Abelman v. Booth in 1857, the Wisconsin Supreme Court said the act violated the Constitution. The United States Supreme Court in 1859 upheld the constitutionality of the Fugitive Slave Act, but by then, the act had become a dead letter. The Whigs disintegrate and the new parties rise. Pro-slavery initiatives, this conflict over slavery split both major political parties along sectional lines and stymied creative political leadership. The Whig Party chose General Winfield Scott. Democrats were divided at their convention and settled on a compromise nominee, Franklin Pierce. The Democrats swept the election because the Whig Party had split into sectional wings, fragmented over slavery. Pierce's acceptance of the Ostend Manifesto in 1854 that suggested the seizing of Cuba from Spain to satisfy Southern expansionists infuriated Northern Democrats and revived fears of a slave power conspiracy. Pierce pursued an expansionist foreign policy to assist Northern merchants. He secured railroad rights in northern Mexico with the Gadsden Purchase to mollify Southern planters. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Events in the Trans-Mississippi West created major controversy. Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas suggested the voiding of Indian rights in the Great Plains, the construction of a transcontinental railroad linking Chicago with California, and the establishment of a large free territory called Nebraska. To attract Southern support, Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act divided the Northern Louisiana Purchase into two territories, Kansas and Nebraska, and voided the Missouri Compromise line by opening area to slavery through the principle of popular sovereignty. The Kansas-Nebraska Act barely passed in 1854. The Republican and American parties. The Kansas-Nebraska Act proved to be the end of the second party system. Anti-slavery Northern Whigs and anti-Nebraska Democrats formed a new party in 1854, the Republicans. The new party stood for opposition to slavery and a celebration of the moral virtues of a society based on the middling classes who own the soil and work it with their own hands. The American, or Know-Nothing Party, had its origins in the anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic organizations of the 1840s. It hoped to unite native-born Protestants against the alien menace of Irish and German Catholics, prohibit further immigration, and institute literacy tests for voting. Bleeding Kansas. In 1855, the Pierce administration recognized controversial territorial legislature in Lecompton, Kansas, which had adopted pro-slavery legislation. Free Soilers rejected the legitimacy of the territorial government. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery sides turned to violence, including the Pottawatomie Massacre led by John Brown. Buchanan's failed presidency. The election of 1856. The Republican Party nominated James C. Fremont for president, a Free Soiler who won fame in the conquest of Mexican California and the Mexican War. The American Party split into sectional factions over slavery. Northern factions endorsed Fremont. Southern factions nominated Millard Fillmore. The Democrats reaffirmed support for popular sovereignty in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and they nominated James Buchanan. Buchanan won, and Republicans replaced the Whigs as the second major party. Republicans had no Southern support. However, if they were to win in 1860, it might prompt Southern states to succeed. Buchanan was left to devise a way to maintain the nation and stop it from splitting. Dred Scott, the petitioner for freedom. The Dred Scott versus Sanford decision of 1857, the Supreme Court ruled that a slave's residence in a free state did not make him a free man. Chief Justice Roger Taney declared African Americans were not citizens, so therefore they could not sue in federal court. The provisions of the Northwest Ordinance and the Missouri Compromise, according to Taney, that prohibited slavery were never ever constitutional. Taney endorsed Calhoun's popular sovereignty, which said that only when settlers wrote a constitution and requested statehood could slavery be prohibited. In other words, the Congress had no right to call the shots in a territory, only after they applied for statehood. Republicans countered by accusing the Supreme Court and Buchanan of participating in slave power conspiracy. Buchanan in 1858 proposed to admit Kansas as a slave state. It split his party and the nation apart when it came to his pro-slavery agenda. Abraham Lincoln and the Republican triumph from 1858 to 1860. Abraham Lincoln came from an impoverished yeoman farming family in Illinois. In 1831, he rejected the farmer's life and became a store clerk. Lincoln was an ambitious man. He was admitted to the bar in 1837, married the more socially prominent Mary Todd in 1842, and served 4 terms as a Whig in the Illinois Assembly. In 1846, Lincoln won election to Congress, where he had to take a stand on the issue of slavery. He believed that slavery was unjust, but did not think that the federal government had the constitutional authority to tamper with it. Lincoln argued that prohibiting the expansion of slavery, gradual emancipation, and the colonization of freed slaves were the only practical ways to address the issue. Both abolitionists and pro-slavery activists derided Lincoln's pragmatic policies. He lost his bid for re-election, and for a while he withdrew from politics in order to devote his time to law. Lincoln returned to politics after the passage of Stephen Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act. He attacked the doctrine of popular sovereignty and reaffirmed his opposition to slavery in the territories. The Lincoln-Douglas debates. Lincoln abandoned the Whig Party and joined the Republicans. He soon emerged as their leader in Illinois. In his House Divided speech, Lincoln predicted a constitutional crisis over slavery. In the 1858 duel for the U.S. Senate, Stephen Douglas declared his support for white supremacy, and Lincoln, put on the defensive by Douglas, advocated economic opportunity for blacks but not equal political rights. Douglas's Freeport doctrine asserted that settlers could exclude slavery by not adopting local legislation to protect it. This upset pro-slavery advocates and abolitionists. Douglas was reelected to the Senate, but Lincoln had established a national profile. Southern Democrats divided into 2 groups. The moderates, Southern rights Democrats, pursued protection of slavery in the territories, and the fire eaters, who repudiated the Union and actively promoted secession. Northern anti-slavery radicals called for stronger action. In October 1859, John Brown led a raid that temporarily seized the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His purpose was to supply the arms for a major slave rebellion that would end slavery. Brown was charged with treason, sentenced to death, and hanged. He was a martyr to abolitionists, which horrified Southerners. In 1860, Northern Democrats rejected Jefferson Davis's program to protect slavery in the territories, so the delegates from 8 Southern states quit the meeting. Southern Democrats nominated as their candidate John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. Meeting separately, Northern and Midwestern delegates nominated Stephen Douglas. The election of 1860. Republicans chose Lincoln as their candidate for his moderate position on slavery, his appealing egalitarian image, and his important Midwest political base. The 4th candidate was John Bell, a former Tennessee Whig who was the nominee for the compromise-seeking Constitutional Union Party. Lincoln received only 40% of the popular vote, but won a majority in the Electoral College by carrying every northern and western state except New Jersey. Douglas won electoral votes only in Missouri and New Jersey. Breckinridge captured every state in the Deep South as well as Delaware, Maryland, and North Carolina. John Bell carried the Upper South states. Republicans had united the Northeast, the Midwest, and the Far West behind free soil. To many Southerners, it seemed their constitutional order of slavery was now under siege, and they had to rethink their future. So a quick review of Manifest Destiny, how that led to things like the Mexican-American War, the Free Soil Platform, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas, the Dred Scott decision, the election of 1860. That does it for Chapter 13. Until next time, thanks for watching.